Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping professional webinar series. We're going to get started in a few minutes, probably right around 10 o'clock. If you feel like it, go ahead and put some questions in the chat box. You could put like where you're from, or if you have a favorite mangrove. You can put that in the chat box, and we'll get started here in just a minute or two. But people are still kind of logging on, so we'll give them just a few minutes to log on here. All right, well, it is 10 o'clock and we could go ahead and get started. Once again, good morning and welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Professional Webinar Series. Today's webinar is Mangroves Coming to a Neighborhood Near You with Alyssa Vinson. She'll cover mangrove identification, ecology, and mangrove pruning BMPs. The webinar is approved for 1 ISA, FNGLA, LIAF, DVPR, and FDAC CEU. There is a $10 administration fee to receive the CEU. And I'll put a link in the chat box to make payment for that certificate if you haven't already done so. We'll submit the CEUs to the licensing agency either tomorrow or Thursday. So make sure if you want to get the CEU to go ahead and do that by the end of the day would be great. And this is part of a monthly webinar series held on the second Tuesday of the month at 10 a.m. So next month webinar is Color in the Landscape with Dr. Gail Hansen. You may notice that your microphones have been muted. So please put any questions in the chat box and we'll take them at the end of the presentation. And also you'll see a survey invitation pop up. If you can, please take a moment to fill this out as it really helps us determine what educational programs to offer. And with that, I'll turn this over to Tom Wickman to introduce today's speaker.
Claire, thank you so much. As Claire said, my name is Tom Wickman. I am the statewide GIBMP coordinator and also the assistant director for Florida Friendly Landscaping. And it's my pleasure to be able to introduce today's webinar presenter. Alyssa Vinson is an avid lover of all things outdoors. She enjoys spending time in gardens, on trails, and in the water. She's been an environmental science educator for the past 15 years, working in Alaska, Oregon, and now Florida. We're glad she's in Florida now. She holds a master's degree from the University of Florida in ecological restoration and is a certified arborist through the International Society of Arboriculture. Her current role as the residential horticulture agent in Manatee County allows her to work with the Master Gardener Volunteer Program, the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, and the Master Naturalist Program. With an emphasis on resilient and sustainable landscape practices, her work spans ecology, horticulture, urban forestry, and volunteer and community development to deliver research-based education to the communities of Southwest Florida. Today, Alyssa is presenting a very important topic to Florida. Today's presentation is titled Mangroves Coming to a Neighborhood Near You. It's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Alyssa. Alyssa, take it away.
Thank you so much, Tom and Claire and Melissa in the background making everything work. I'm really happy to be with you all today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see the presentation there. Just want to make sure, give me a thumbs up if you can see just the presentation. Type it in the chat box, give me a reaction. We're all good. Okay. So good morning, everybody. I see we've got folks from all across. We've got some folks from, let's see, Orange County, Brevard, Orlando, Trinity, all across St. Pete. Hey, St. Pete, you're just north of me. As Tom said, I am the residential horticulture agent in Manatee County, Florida. So I am just south of Tampa Bay. I've been in Florida on and off for about 20 years now. I moved down here when I was in high school, and it's been a slow learning process to really appreciate all that this state has to offer. And I just want to share a quick story, kind of how I came to really love Florida is really all about mangroves. And I got my undergraduate degree from the University of South Florida. I know, not Gators, but in Tampa. And I had the privilege of working in on a project with a PhD student. And I spent about a week down in Rookery Bay. And during that time, we were slogging through the mangrove marshes. We were doing transect analyses of the different kinds of plant species that are found growing near mangrove seedlings, looking at kind of companion species to mangroves to see if there was any kind of relationship there that led to greater success for those mangrove seedlings. And as I was down there, I saw all of the amazing fish, crustaceans, sponges, insects, birds, all of this life that was dependent on this one particular tree species. And it really just lit this spark of fascination for me, spending that much time really with the different mangrove species. And so ever since then, I've been fascinated by them. And I've been lucky enough to work in and around mangroves now for about the last 9 years. And I spent 3 years working in Sarasota County in their environmental regulation division, responsible for kind of enforcing the local mangrove ordinance there. And so I've been able to see both sides. I've been able to be on the regulatory side and be on the kind of education and learning side. And so I hope that the perspective that I've gained helps you learn a little bit more about mangroves. So we're going to start just basically what is a mangrove, because some of you all might be located in counties where you don't have mangroves right now. And so at its very basic, a mangrove is a tree species that exhibits halophytic characteristics, meaning it likes to be in salty environments. It's better at being in salty environments than it is at being in freshwater environments. Doesn't mean that it can't live in freshwater, and actually it needs some amount of freshwater flushing in order for it to be healthy. But you can see in the map here where we tend to find mangroves located throughout the world. It is about 7% of the world's coastlines have mangroves. Not all of the mangrove species are distributed all around the world. Here in Florida, we have 3 species that are protected by state law, and really 4 species that are considered mangrove species when you look at kind of lists of mangrove species from all over the world. And so the picture that you're seeing on the left is of one of our common 3 species of protected mangroves. This is the red mangrove. We'll talk more about identifying them in a little bit. But so sometimes we see them standing out in the water, right? This mangrove is in the tidal zone. It gets tidal fluctuation going up and down its roots over the course of the day. But we also see them in terrestrial environments. So we see them where they are not inundated by water at all. They're completely upland, and they're in a very sandy environment. Or like the picture on the right, which is a black mangrove, and the one on the left is a white mangrove. The one on the right, the black mangrove, is going to be partially in that intertidal area, but not fully inundated like that red mangrove is. So these are kind of the ones that we see in our area. But sometimes mangroves are also forage for camels. I found this to be really fascinating when I was doing some research on mangroves worldwide. In the Arabian Peninsula, they actually have mangroves in some of the coastal areas, and so you get camels walking down to the mangroves and actually eating the leaves of the mangroves. And when we think about mangroves, oftentimes, we associate them with canal banks or backyards, and we think of them as kind of short hedges. But the picture you're seeing on the right here is actually of our state champion red mangrove, which is 64 feet tall. Now, This was located on private property in Lee County, which, as you know, Lee County was one of the counties worst damaged by Hurricane Ian recently. So I'd be curious to see how this tree kind of held up after the storm. But 64 feet tall is our champion red mangrove. When you move further south than Florida into the Caribbean and Central America, you find mangroves in the 60 to 70 foot range pretty normally. And so what we think of as mangroves, we have to realize that those species don't always look that way in other parts of the world. And in fact, the Sundarbans in India are mangrove systems that are home to tigers. So, we think about mangroves often in this very kind of boxed in view because of how we see them in Florida, but they are a vastly diverse and interesting group of trees. And I want to point out that where we talk about, like, let's say we were talking about oaks, right? Oaks would all be in the genus Quercus. They would all be Quercus alba, Quercus virginiana, right? Our mangrove species don't occupy a single genus. They are a multitude of genuses, all representative of different families of plants. And so our black mangrove is Avicennia germinans, white mangrove is Laguncularia racemosa, and our red mangrove is Rhizophora mangala. So you see those botanical names are all distinctly different, but they all share common characteristics. Those characteristics are based on their ability to live in these estuarine environments where we have a mix of fresh and salty water, right? They're a salt-tolerant species, but they do require freshwater input. And actually, when you look at our 3 species of protected mangroves that we have here in Florida, black mangroves are the most salt-tolerant because they tend to be in the areas that kind of collect water at the high tide, and then as the tide recedes, the water kind of stays there for a while, and as it evaporates, it gets hypersaline. And so the black mangroves are very, very salt tolerant. Red mangroves, even though they're standing out in the water, are actually our least salt tolerant species. And that's because they're constantly getting flushed with water. You don't have standing salt water there that has the opportunity to get hypersaline. So they also, you don't find them in dune systems, right? They like those low energy shorelines, particularly when you get into some of our rivers as they come out into the bay and into the Gulf of Mexico. You reach that estuary system, those low energy areas, they really like to occupy that space. They have special adaptations within kind of the structure of their bodies that allow them to live in these salty environments. And so red mangroves have these prop roots that reach down into the water and into the substrate. And on each of these prop roots, there are little bumps, and you can feel them when you feel the prop roots. And these are lenticels. Other trees have lenticels as well, but the red mangrove lenticels that they have on their prop roots will actually close up during that high tide event, and it prevents the salt water from getting into the roots of the red mangrove. So red mangroves exclude salt. They try to keep the salt out of their bodies. Black and white mangroves are what we call salt extruders. They push the salt out through glands that they have on their leaves or on their petiole of the leaf. And we'll take a closer look at some of those leaves here in a minute. They also, these 3 species, have a trait called viviparity, which means that the new plant starts its germination process before it's left the parent plant. So when you see propagules hanging from a mangrove tree, they actually have already started that germination process. And red mangrove propagules, the seedlings from red mangroves, can actually float out in the open ocean for up to a year before they find a suitable location where they want to establish. And you can watch over the course of 5 days, a red mangrove propagule can go from fully horizontal on the substrate surface to pulling itself upright and having the root portion establish into the substrate while the new leaves grow from the top. Now, I do want to encourage you, please type questions into the chat box as we go along. And if something pops up that we need to address, I'll make sure to address it. So this is kind of a general overview of what a mangrove is. We also have kind of a fourth species that's considered a mangrove here in Florida. When we look at the 3 protected species, we have red, white, and black, and I'll talk more about what makes each one distinct. But then we also have buttonwoods. So Conocarpus erectus. Buttonwoods are considered a mangrove when you look at some of their characteristics, such as being able to kind of withstand these salty environments. They are often associated with mangroves. We find them living in and among mangrove fringes and mangrove swamps. But for whatever reason, they're not really considered to be a species worthy of protection here in the state of Florida. And so buttonwoods don't have those same protections that the other 3 species have. However, oftentimes, if you're a professional and you're working in an area where there are protected mangrove species, those buttonwoods may be protected by additional local encumbrances related to native plants. So it's always good to kind of double check. We'll talk about regulations in a little bit. A really key difference, though, how you can tell between the 3 protected species and our buttonwood species is that all 3 of the protected mangrove species have opposite leaf arrangement. So if I'm the stem, my leaves are going to be opposite each other on the 3 protected mangrove species. Buttonwoods have an alternate leaf arrangement, so the leaves are going to be arranged alternately around the stem. So when you're looking at these species out on a shoreline, that's going to be your first key tell that you're looking at a buttonwood and not at a mangrove. Red mangroves, Rhizophora mangala, are the mangroves that we find furthest out in the water. They're going to be most influenced by tidal fluctuation. The reason they're called red mangroves is because they have these reddish brown prop roots. They reach down and they kind of spread out in a horizontal fashion. Red mangroves are also called the walking trees because of the way that they grow horizontally. I actually found on Siesta Key down here near me, I found a red mangrove that had a single horizontal prop root that was 32 feet long. Really just incredible horizontal growth on some of these prop roots. And as they reach down and grab the substrate, they're also holding the soil, catching debris, building soil, and really building islands. And as that soil builds up, they create space for the other 2 mangrove species to establish. So you tend to get the black mangrove kind of first, and then as you build up more of that sediment and you get into higher elevation, then you have your white mangroves coming in kind of at the top of a little berm that would build up behind the red mangroves. So red mangroves have these prop roots. They're adventitious. They come down. I'll show you a picture in a little bit. You can have a red mangrove that's 30 feet tall, and you'll have prop roots coming from branches at 25 feet and reaching down into the water and into the substrate. They're propagules. You can see them here in this photo. They look kind of like pencils with a reddish brown end and a green end. The reddish brown end is going to be that first root. It's going to turn into that first root. So it's going to establish right there with the green end pointing up, and it's going to have its leaves that come out then. White mangroves, going next to the right. You can see the white mangrove here Its leaves are distinctly different from the other two species in that they tend to be very round. We're going to take a look at them a little bit more up close in a minute. They tend to be more round, and sometimes they have a little notch in the tip as well. They also have two bumps on the petiole right at the base of the leaf. And we'll see that as well. You can see a picture of the white mangrove propagules here. I kind of think they look like teardrops. They're kind of teardrop shaped. They're about the size of a lima bean. So they're teardrop shaped, and they're about the size of a lima bean. But you can see that they have kind of these 2 or 3 distinct ridges on them. So that's a good way to tell the white mangrove propagules. Black mangroves, they're my favorite. They have these really unique pneumatophores that come up out of the soil, and they used to be called dead man's fingers, which is really kind of creepy, and part of the reason why I like them. But they have these pneumatophores that come up out of the soil that allow the plant to exchange gases, right? We know that if we put a plant in a pot and we keep the roots wet constantly, the roots will eventually die, right? Same thing goes for a black mangrove. Because the soil is so frequently inundated, they have to have these special pneumatophores that allow those roots to exchange gases so that they don't start to rot and decline. So black mangroves have pneumatophores. They have, you can see here in this photo, I really like this photo. This is at Lemon Bay Park down in Englewood, if you're ever in this area. This does a really good job of showing how the structure of the black mangrove trunk kind of establishes over time. If it's allowed to have a really nice tree form, it really has a nice single or maybe 2 or 3 trunked structure. It has a nice shape to it, similar to like a small oak or something like that. It has little furrows in the nice dark bark. And I'll show you a picture up close of what the leaves look like. And the leaves are really one of the reasons why it's my favorite. Buttonwoods, they're going to be typically a multi-trunked, shrubby, small tree. You can see the margin of the leaf extends down the petiole here, and they're pretty leathery. The leaves are pretty leathery. Mangrove leaves tend to be a little bit succulent feeling, a little bit thicker, a little bit succulent, white mangroves especially, and then red mangroves have a very lime green coloration to the underside of the leaf. So here's Rhizophora up close. This is our red mangrove. And you can see here the really pointy tip of the leaf, the really bright green, yellow mid-vein on the leaf. And on the underside of the leaf, you have this really bright yellow green. And so that kind of gives you a good idea of the size and shape of the red mangrove leaf. The photo on the right I show mainly because this mangrove is about 22 feet tall. This is at Emerson Point Preserve here in Manatee County. And you can see the adventitious roots, these prop roots, coming down from the uppermost branches on the red mangrove, coming down all the way down to the substrate. And you can see them dropping down here. So that gives you a good idea of what those prop roots look like. Let me see. Okay, no questions. Here is Avicennia up close. This is the black mangrove, and you can see here the flower and up close of the flower. The propagules of black mangroves are very much like lima beans. They're like large lima beans, and they have a kind of rough, bumpy surface. So where the white mangrove has like a ribbed teardrop shape, the black mangrove is lima bean shaped, and it has a rough, bumpy surface. Here's a really good up close picture of what the flower looks like. And I love this photo. On the left, especially because you can see all of the salt crystals that have accumulated on the leaf over the course of the day. And this is just showing you how those species adapt to living in this salty environment by pushing all of that salt out onto the leaves. And you can actually just go along and swipe your thumb along there and lick it, and it's just sea salt. But you can also see in this photo the nice shape that we have here of the black mangrove leaf. You can see the underside is kind of a blue-green. When you see black mangroves growing among other mangroves, they tend to have a very upright structure to their leaves. They kind of reach up, and you can see that blue-green underside. And when you see their coloration in a whole mangrove hedge, you have the bright yellow-green color of the reds, and whites tend to have that color too. And then the black mangroves are just like this shock of gray, blue, really lovely, distinct color difference in the black mangroves. And here you can see an up close of Laguncularia racemosa, the white mangrove. And here you can see those two bumps on the petiole right here. So again, this is a very round leaf with a little notch at the tip, and there's two bumps right there on the petiole. And so this really gives you a good idea of what those white mangrove leaves look like. White mangroves don't have any visible roots, so they don't have adventitious roots, they don't have pneumatophores 99.9% of the time. And I say that because I have found in a couple instances where white mangroves are in environments that are frequently inundated, and maybe the hydrology changed or something like that. But I have seen a couple instances where white mangroves will send up pneumatophores, but they don't look like a black mangrove pneumatophore, like skinny fingers. It's more like bumpy nodules that kind of come up from the roots. And again, I've only seen that in a couple of cases. And so there was a question that just came in about mangrove reproduction. And so again, we have that viviparous trait, right, where mangroves begin the germination process when they're still on the parent plant. All three of our mangrove species here in Florida flower and fruit all year round. We do see a kind of bump in production in the white mangroves and black mangroves in the March through kind of June timeframe, but red mangroves, they're super productive and they go all year round. So now that we kind of have an understanding, or at least I think we do, an understanding of the species that we have here in Florida, I want to take just some time to talk about what mangroves do in the ecosystem and why they're so important. And so I really like this image here because it shows you a kind of a good kind of layered view of the ecosystem. But we know mangroves are what's considered to be a keystone species because as they build the soil, they drop leaf litter, and this leaf litter and the capture of sediments from upland areas feeds the smallest little bivalves, crustaceans, all of the small kind of basic foods of this estuarine system. And then as you continue to move up to little fish, bigger fish, birds, and you get this whole support system created based on this detritus that the mangroves are able to capture and hold, and they add to with their leaf litter as well. Mangrove roots provide roosting habitat, or I should say mangrove canopies provide roosting habitat for a lot of our bird species that are migratory, or there are even some of our endangered or threatened bird species like roseate spoonbills, wood storks that use the mangrove canopies as rookeries. Mangrove roots act as nurseries for fish, and actually Goliath grouper spend a portion of their life cycle in mangrove ecosystems. Many of our shark species utilize mangroves as nurseries. Snook, redfish. There are estimates out there that around about 80% of all commercially and recreationally important fish species spend some amount of time in mangroves as a part of their life cycle. And if you think about it, these red mangrove prop roots, they're reaching down into that substrate. They create a lot of really great little nooks and crannies for small fish to hide in so that they aren't eaten by the larger fish before they have a chance to mature. And a lot of times you'll get fish kind of coming in from deeper water. They spawn near the mangroves. The fry live in the, I'm not a fish biologist, so I use the word fry, but I don't know if that's just for salmon or not. So somebody, if you're a fish person, let me know. But the small fish, they start out there, they use the mangrove roots to hide, and then they go back out to the deeper systems as they reach the maturity or as they reach sexual maturity. So again, snappers, Goliath groupers, redfish, snook. These are all mangrove dependent fish species. Not to mention all of the crustaceans and sponges. Mangrove crabs are just adorable, watching them go up and down the mangroves as the tide changes. We also, we talk a lot about mangroves. I refer to them as the kidneys of the coast because of the way that they capture and filter out pollution from upland systems. I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But one of the habitats that mangroves provide is oyster, right? The prop roots of red mangroves harbor lots and lots of oysters, and oysters are great water filters. And so that's part of their function as that kidney of the coast, right, is to provide that habitat, that structure for oysters so that they can do the water filtration that they need to do. So I'm going to pause just for a second. And we can see, I think, for those of us especially who have been around mangroves, kind of the wealth that they provide to our coastlines. But it's not always a rosy picture, our interaction with mangroves. And so for the next couple slides, I want to talk to you just a little bit about how mangrove systems have changed over time and how they might be changing for you in particular if you live in one of our northern coastal counties in Florida. So this photo is of Anna Maria Island. So over here, this is Anna Maria Island. So this is part of Manatee County. This is 1973. And you can see that there's already been some amount of development here. You can see a lot of kind of canals in here. There's a lot of houses out here. There's a major road here. The Intercoastal Waterway was already dredged in this area. But you can still see that there's a lot of area that doesn't have any development. Right? Lots of areas that don't have development here. Big open areas of land down here. And while the next photo shows that we kept some of our big areas of mangroves here, right? A few areas here, a few along here. If you notice what's happened in the inland areas and out on the island, we have a huge amount of development occurring. And as the upland areas are developed, what we're doing is increasing, obviously, the amount of runoff that we're producing with our impervious surfaces. We're changing the flow and compounds that are in the water as it gets to the mangroves. But we're also, as we consider implications related to climate change and sea level rise, we are taking away any of the interior space where mangroves could retreat in the face of sea level rise. And so I think the next slide does a good kind of shows you really what I mean by that, where we used to maybe have large expanses of mangrove wetlands leading to slight topography changes going into our upland areas. In a lot of cases where this development has occurred along our coastlines, now we have seawalls. And there's a large effort within Florida Sea Grant, in Southwest Florida, in a lot of places in the Southeast in general, to kind of rethink our approach to seawalls? Are there ways that we can engineer them better? Can we add plants? Can we add structure to create habitat? But what we do here, now we don't have any place for those mangroves to retreat to. So we are changing the hydrology, we're changing the water chemistry, and we're also taking away any place for those mangroves to go. So where we used to have large expanses that could spread and change as water levels changed, now we've put mangroves into this pinch point where they're between rising water and a hard infrastructure. Okay. So I talked about a little bit of this when I talked about ecosystems. They are a keystone species, critical, they provide critical habitat. But some of the things that I want to focus on from an ecosystem services perspective is shoreline stabilization in particular. So we just recently went through Hurricane Ian. We've got Tropical Storm Hurricane Nicole out there right now. And mangroves are really fascinating from a shoreline resilience perspective, in that when we do studies and modeling and looking at areas in other parts of the world that have been impacted by storms, we can see that mangrove shorelines can actually minimize wind and wave energy by as much as 60%. So they act like a big sponge, a big buffer to absorb a lot of that energy before it reaches the upland areas. But it also kind of keeps all of that erosion from going out into the waterway. And so it holds the soil, and it also catches a lot of our pollution, a lot of our garbage. They grab onto a lot of it and they hold onto a lot of it. So we see this shoreline stabilization benefit. We also know that mangrove ecosystems sequester carbon at a rate of almost 10 times that of a tropical rainforest. Now, there's a lot more area that's taken up by tropical rainforest in the world, but mangroves are really efficient at grabbing and sequestering carbon. Not only are they good at grabbing and sequestering carbon, they're also good at capturing heavy metals, nitrogen, and phosphorus. There are some really good studies out of Australia that look at mangroves that are downstream from kind of heavy manufacturing facilities, and looking at the uptake of things like mercury out of the water, and arsenic. So pulling some of those really nasty things we don't want in our water out and kind of holding them in place is a job that mangroves do really, really well. When we look at our interconnectedness between our upland environments and our marine environments, mangroves are kind of that buffer between all of the activities that we do in our upland areas to increase impervious surface, increase runoff, add pollution. They act as this buffer before everything in that water gets out into the marine environment. And so when we look at healthy seagrass, healthy coral systems, they depend on a certain amount of sunlight getting through the water column. And so there has to be good water clarity in order for seagrasses and corals to be healthy. And mangroves help provide that necessary water clarity by pulling those sediments out of the water and holding them in place in those estuaries. So we really, when we look at trying to value ecosystem services, there are always really broad ranges of kind of dollar value, and mangroves are the same. You can get $250 a hectare up to $1 billion a hectare if you look at the right studies. So putting a price value on ecosystem services for mangroves is difficult, but we can see as we go through each of these kind of key components what we lose when we lose mangroves. And I will add too that we lose a lot of our productivity from a food chain perspective, our carbon sequestration capacity, habitat, when we trim them inappropriately as well. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So since mangroves are so important for Florida, they are protected, and there are different ways that they are protected. So we have this, national wetlands rule that is administered by the US EPA, and this came about as a result of the Clean Water Act, right? We had all of this legislation that happened in like 1972, 1973, up into the early 90s, and the national wetlands rule is one of those. And so the US EPA is responsible for enforcing that. Here in Florida, we have the 1996 Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act. This act was put into legislation following several iterations of some mangrove protection rules that started in around about 1979, and again went through several iterations before we reached the 1996 Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act. This act has not demonstrably changed since 1996. There has been one amendment that I know of, and it's related to who's considered a professional mangrove trimmer. We have additional wetland rules here in the state of Florida. Those are administered through our water management districts. And then we have local environmental protections. There may be specific native plant protections or wetland protections that are put in place through local county ordinances or city ordinances. Within the 1996 Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act is the ability of a local government to receive what's called delegation of the state rule. This delegation allows that local government to administer the rule in their municipality. They have to maintain all of the same exemption criteria, but they can change some of the requirements for permitted trimming events if they receive delegation. So this is just some, these are, 5 of the potential different regulations, ordinances, rules that you may have to consider if you have mangroves in or around your property or you're working on mangroves. Now, for those of you that aren't in an area where mangroves typically are located, one of the things that we have documented over the last 15 years or so is the northward migration of mangroves in the state of Florida. And you can see this figure on the right shows you the red is a decrease in mangrove area, black being an increase in mangrove area. So you can see that as we go up the East Coast, we've had much higher instances of increase in mangrove area moving up. We now document black mangroves as far up as St. Augustine and even a little bit further on the East Coast. And this poses a lot of really challenging situations where we take one ecosystem, the salt marsh ecosystem, that provides all those ecosystem benefits that I talked about that mangroves provide, right? Salt marshes do that too. They do it through slightly different mechanisms, but to the same effect. They are keystone species, they hold the soil, they sequester carbon, right? Salt marshes are highly productive ecosystems. And so you have black mangroves, because they're the most cold tolerant of the 3 species, moving northward and invading, if you will, these salt marsh ecosystems. And so we have to figure out as a state, as natural land managers, as property owners, how do we manage this shifting northward of mangroves? So if you don't have mangroves yet in your area, you most likely will, within the next 5 to 10 years, start to see more mangroves moving northward. Now, mangroves are freeze intolerant. So if there are hard freezes, that will, kill them back a little bit. But again, black mangroves are the most cold tolerant of the 3 species. And so they will be the ones that you'll find further north. There are lots of collaborations at the university level across the Southeast to kind of track this migration and talk about, what are the implications here, and how do we kind of manage these shifting boundaries? And we're seeing this in a lot of different species, right? We're seeing this in other tree species moving across the temperate zones as well. And so, it bears the question, we're kind of in a position where we might have to allow, some of these salt marshes to become mangrove systems, with the understanding that the same ecosystem benefits exist, but that's a hard balance to strike. So what do you need to know if you have mangroves on your property, or maybe you're starting to see mangroves on your property? I'm going to go through just the basic exemptions that the state criteria outlines. I'm not going to talk about permits or what you might need to do to apply for a permit. I'm just going to recommend that you reach out to your local DEP office, and I have the numbers for those on a slide coming up. But from an exemption perspective, one of the first things to note is that the mangrove shoreline depth has to be less than 50 feet, and it has to meet the state definition of a riparian mangrove fringe. And if I encourage you all to read the state legislation. I think it's about 15 pages long. I've read it several times. But the definition of a riparian mangrove fringe has to do with its connectivity to the shoreline and the presence of wetland soils there. So it has to be less than 50 feet deep, and it has to meet the state definition of a riparian mangrove fringe. So these exemptions are for private property where mangroves are taller than 10 feet from the substrate, so always measuring from the substrate and not the water, and they aren't trimmed below 6 feet from the substrate in overall height, okay? If your shoreline length is greater than 150 feet, they will need to have only 65% of the mangroves on that shoreline trimmed. Okay, so 0 to 150 feet can be trimmed by a homeowner or a professional mangrove trimmer, depending on the height. Or if it's greater than 150 feet, you can only trim 65% of the mangroves along that shoreline. For height requirements, you can see DEP has this really nice graphic that they provide. So anything above 24 feet is going to require a DEP permit. Anything between 16 and 24 feet, there are going to be some restrictions on trimming related to how much foliage you can remove in any trimming event. Anything above 10 feet is going to require a professional mangrove trimmer. Okay. If you are a private property owner and you have mangroves that are in the 6 to 10 foot range on your property, and your property is, 0 to 150 feet and it's 50 foot deep, then you are within your right under an exemption to trim between that 6 to 10 foot mark, right? Now, you can never take mangroves overall height to less than 6 feet. So you can't trim them down to less than 6 feet in overall height. Okay, so again, these are just the basics of the exemptions, and I'm going to put up the numbers for DEP so that you can call them and ask them questions, because I don't want anybody to think that they can do something and then they get in trouble, right? Now, there are 7 locally delegated governments in the state of Florida, so also check and make sure that yours is not one of those. Here in Southwest Florida, Pinellas County, Hillsborough County, Sarasota County are all locally delegated governments. So if you're in one of those 3 counties, you'll need to reach out to your county's environmental protection division to find out about mangrove permitting. Okay. Now, when you're pruning mangroves, one of the biggest things that I want you to take away from this presentation, for those of you that are gardeners, are arborists, are folks that work in landscapes, mangroves are trees. We need to treat them like trees. When we treat them like shrubs, we end up cutting them to 6 feet, year after year after year. We concentrate the foliage in the top 6 inches of the canopy. And then if we get a hurricane or some other kind of environmental disturbance, you end up completely defoliated and the mangroves aren't able to come back from that. So we've all seen those hedges, right, where they're just trimmed year after year after year to the same spot. We really want to avoid that with mangroves. Mangroves should not be trimmed in that fashion. They are trees. Red mangroves have particularly thin bark. It's easy to tear the bark when you are pruning them. So it's really important to use sharp tools, right? Sharp tools are safe tools. They're safer for us. They're also safer for the tree. Just like you would on a tree, you need to use good pruning cuts on mangroves. And one thing that I'll mention specific to red mangroves is that you really, if you are needing to trim any of the prop roots, that's going to require some special permission to do so, first of all. But second of all, if you cut a prop root kind of in the middle, right? If you have a 6-foot long prop root and you cut it at 3 feet, it's not going to regrow well from that area. So that prop root needs to be taken all the way back to the stem from which it emerges. Okay. So when you have a branch kind of coming out here, particularly with red mangroves, again, they have that thinner bark. They tend to tear really easily. So doing an undercut is a really good practice for pruning red mangroves. 3 steps. You make your undercut about 12 inches out from the trunk. You make your top cut farther out on the limb, and then you remove the stub, leaving the collar intact. The collar on the tree has a lot of antimicrobial, antifungal chemicals that the tree produces. And if you cut into the collar, so you can see here, yes, no, right, yes, no. If you cut into that collar, then you're minimizing the ability of that tree to handle potential pathogens that might be present. You also end up with poor woundwood development, which is bad overall for the health of the tree. This is going to leave it open to pests and disease, and you may end up with decay there in the tree. This is a bad cut. It's a bad cut because you can see that it cut into the collar. It is asymmetrical, right? This is how this healed. This heals really poorly. So just like pruning a tree, right? We prune mangroves like we prune trees with appropriate cuts, making sure to avoid flush cutting. We avoid things like lion's tailing. Something that I see very frequently in mangrove hedges is, so there's a technique called window trimming or vista trimming, where you leave a lower canopy and maintain an upper canopy by removing lateral branches in the 6 to 12 foot range. And a lot of times when trimmers come in and they're asked to maintain that kind of configuration, they end up lion's tailing the upper canopy and pushing a lot of the foliage out to the end of the branches in the upper canopy. And then you get a big wind event and it either completely defoliates or you get stem failure because you've put that leverage point way out at the end of the branch, right? We want to avoid lion's tailing, flush cutting. You really, again, make sure that your tools are nice and sharp, especially with red mangroves because the bark will tear very easily. Also, when you're working in and around mangroves, it can be really tricky to know where one mangrove ends and another one begins. And you're also going to have trouble. You're going to be stepping on pneumatophores. You might have to climb on prop roots. So you really have to think carefully about your personal safety. Some best practices that I've learned from some local arboricultural professionals in our area, they actually take small, like 3-foot ladders out with them, and they put boards across it when they're working in the mangroves so that they have something to stand on, so they're not walking on the pneumatophores and the prop roots the whole time. If you have your boots on and you're walking on prop roots on a red mangrove, you will tear that bark. You just will. Their bark is really thin. So it's really good to have a plan in place to avoid kind of crushing all of the roots and stepping on the prop roots. So this begs the question, who can trim, right? And the state rule sets up these individuals called professional mangrove trimmers. And a professional mangrove trimmer, according to the state rule, is an ISA certified arborist, so somebody who is certified through ISA, professional wetland scientists, certified environmental professionals, certified ecologists, or landscape architects that are currently licensed under this particular Chapter 481. And I believe one of the amendments that's happened in the last 10 years or so, the only one that I know of, is that the landscape architects now have to have some additional kind of training, or they have to prove that they know how to trim a mangrove in order to be considered a professional mangrove trimmer. And the DEP maintains a list of individuals on their webpage, and the link is here, to folks who are professional mangrove trimmers, but that list is not exhaustive. I want to point that out. In order to get on that DEP list, you have to ask to be put on that list. So I would have to reach out to DEP and say, hey, I'm a certified arborist. Please put me on your list of professional mangrove trimmers. So don't go to that list as an exhaustive list. If you are an individual who's looking for help with your mangroves, or maybe you are a certified arborist and you want to get on that list so people know that you're a PMT, reach out to DEP to get on that list, or folks that want to kind of look around and see if there's individuals that might be able to help them. You can go to treesaregood.org and you can search for an arborist that's in your area. For any questions related to mangrove trimming, right? There's a lot of good publications out there that give you, this is exempt, this is what requires a permit. This is actually from Pinellas County, but every locally delegated governments, individual municipalities, they're all going to have different rules, potential encumbrances on the land. You may run into issues with DEP as far as submerged lands go. So there's a lot of potential issues when you start to get into mangrove work. And so I definitely encourage you, here are the numbers for the people at DEP in these different districts that you can call to find out if you need a permit, if you need a letter of exemption, to get on that PMT list. So these folks here, these are the numbers. I'm sorry, I forgot to put the hyphen in the first one there. These are the numbers that you can call to reach somebody at DEP who's responsible for mangrove trimming. Okay, and I'll leave this slide up just for a second. And I see we've got a lot of stuff in the chat box, so that's good, because I'm just about out of time and we can ask questions. All right. And I just want to kind of end with a couple of slides. I put these pictures up here. So like, why should you care about mangroves, right? On the far right triangle, you see a salt marsh. And the reason I have that up there is because I want you to think about the fact that this might be changing. This landscape might be changing, and we need to be prepared for how it's going to change. The photo in the middle is a seawall that's failing. We have a lot of infrastructure throughout our state that is reaching the end of its lifespan. We have a lot of seawalls, hardened shorelines that were built in the 1940s and 50s when the Intercoastal Waterway was originally dredged, that are now coming to the end of their lifespan. And we have the opportunity to rethink how we engage with our shorelines. Maybe we can replant some mangroves in a way that allows us to hold that soil in a little bit better way. And then the picture on the far left is of my kayak. And we really have this vast wealth of recreational opportunity in the state when it comes to mangroves. If you've never paddled through a mangrove tunnel, there is nothing like it. You can be a mile from an urban area and you don't hear anything except the birds, because of just this dense canopy that they produce. It is a fascinating world that's right at our doorstep. And so I really encourage you to go out and experience that if you haven't. Remember, red mangroves, white mangroves, black mangroves are our 3 protected species. Red mangroves have prop roots, white mangroves have none, black mangroves have pneumatophores. If you are pruning their trees, treat them like trees. Do not prune them into shrubs. Best option is to window trim and enjoy the birds, fish, snakes, everything that you're going to see. Remember that they're protected. Call prior to trimming. For you as a professional, don't take someone's word that they have a letter of exemption or that they have a permit. Ask to see it, follow up with DEP, take photos before and after, protect yourself. Okay, it's very important. You can also look on the Florida DEP's direct map online, and you can find historical permits or compliance issues. You can find out if that property had a historic compliance on site before you get involved. So there are options out there to kind of protect yourself. And if you need help navigating any of those resources, I'm happy to help you. And at the very end, I just encourage you all to learn more. This is my email address. Feel free to email me directly with any of your mangrove related questions. And I just want to put a plug out. Myself, a couple other agents in Florida Sea Grant in Southwest, we're seeing a lot of issues related to debris in our mangroves after Hurricane Ian. And so we're working together to put on kind of a recommendations, best practices for cleaning and restoring mangroves that have been impacted by storms. And we're planning to do a webinar on December 6th for that at noon. So you can email me for more information if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Alyssa, thank you so very much. That was excellent. You know, it's a complicated topic, and so it's one of those things that people really need the information. So you provided so much great information. I do have some questions that people have been putting in the chat box for you, and so we'll start with the first one. What is the coldest temperature that black mangroves can tolerate?
Above freezing. If it gets below freezing, they die. But anything above freezing, you may see some tip dieback, a little bit of leaf loss, but they'll be able to survive it. But you really need a freeze for at least, you know, I want to say 12 to 24 hours, but I would need to check on that. But they really need a freeze in order to die back.
Okay. Should anything actually be done about the migration of mangroves up the East Coast if it's a response to climate change?
That's a really good question.
They ask good questions here.
Yeah, and that's one of those that a lot of people are struggling with. I think that we have a responsibility, and this is me speaking personally, I think that we have a responsibility to give them a place to retreat to, because we've hardened so much of our shoreline in South Florida. You know, they're coming into the Everglades too. You know, they're moving northward into the Everglades, so we're going to see that environment changing. I think that, you know, it's going to be a challenge, but as I said, they also, when we compare ecosystem services between salt marsh and mangrove, it's very similar in the type of ecosystem service that they provide. So it's possible that, you know, we may need to make that allowance, but it's a very complicated topic.
Yeah. Is there science behind why they landed on that 6 foot height as the lowest a mangrove can be trimmed?
I get that question all the time, and as best as I can tell, no. So the state rule, again, there were rules in about 1979 that started to be established for protecting mangroves. And there was a lot of bouncing back and forth. And I think we ended up where we are because the state mangrove rule, it does protect mangroves, but it also enshrines in law a riparian right to view for property owners. So that means that they have a right to see the water from their property. And so I think that that 6 foot mark was kind of selected as like, well, most people are about 6 feet tall. So if we cut them to 6 feet, people will be able to see from their house out to the water. That's my interpretation based on the history I've been able to find for how the law was established.
Okay, I had to pick something, I guess.
Yeah.
Trying to balance all the issues.
Mm-hmm.
Are landscape architects encouraged to incorporate mangroves in landscape designs, in coastal communities?
I would encourage them to do so if there's a shoreline to support them. It's interesting. We've seen recently a lot of buttonwoods being incorporated into landscapes because they are hardy and drought tolerant and salt tolerant. And so in our coastal areas, they are, they're a good species to incorporate. Mangroves, I think some people are afraid to plant them because they're worried about the rules. But I always encourage people to plant them where they have a shoreline to support them. Yeah.
Fantastic. Caesar asked, can you mention the other delegated jurisdictions?
Yes. So Miami-Dade, City of Sanibel. Let's see, that's 5. I think there's one more. I'd have to look at the list and see. But City of Sanibel, Miami-Dade, Sarasota County, Pinellas County, Hillsborough County. Yeah, for sure. Those ones. I'd have to look up the last one.
Fantastic. Alyssa, thank you so much for answering all these questions, providing such great information. If you look in the chat, people loved your presentation and they thought it was very well presented and very informative. So it's one of those topics that I just think was so important that you presented this. So thank you so much for doing that. I do want to remind everyone that this presentation was recorded. It'll go up on the Florida Friendly Landscaping website within the next 2 weeks. And so you will always be able to go back and rewatch that. On December 13th, we'll have our next webinar coming up, and that's December 13th at 10 o'clock Eastern time, and that's Color in the Landscape with Dr. Gail Hansen. Alyssa, thank you once again so much. Everybody, please fill out the survey, as Claire mentioned, it would be popping up. That'll help us plan for next year. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful week, and everybody stay safe.